I think we have to kick this off by me asking about the pillow on the chair that is radiating blue. It almost looks photoshopped. What am I seeing?
Yeah, and there may be a dog that shows up any moment now to sit next to that pillow. The pillow that you're seeing is the visage of a newscaster named Carl Castle, who graced the airwaves of NPR for many decades, an extraordinary journalist. And for the last 10 or 12 years or so of his life, he also did, surprising to many people, a comedy news show called Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me on NPR. And it was taped in Chicago where we were living at the time. And we went to some of the tapings, and they had these lovely pillows with Carl Castle's face on them. And so that is an autographed Carl Castle face pillow. And one of my dogs, a dog named Coconut, happens to love sitting on that chair, and she snuggles up with Carl. So you may get that in the background at some point during our recording here.
That's fantastic.
Cool.
That is an awesome pillow. I love it.
Yeah, if it's creeping you out, I can turn that away. But yeah,
it's perfect. It looks like it's glowing. I do feel like in your background we could analyze all the different objects, and there's probably a story behind everything.
Yeah, there's a drum head from Max Weinberg of the E Street Band, who happens to be a huge Frank Lloyd Wright fan. So that's the big round thing sitting up there. The little stylized penguins that are my spirit animal, and a hell of a lot of art books, and of course a lot of books about Frank Lloyd Wright.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's a lot of stuff back there. And forgive the appearance of the house. We began some projects at the beginning of the pandemic that have gotten stalled due to supply chain. So the house needs to be repainted, but but this was the better place to record.
Yeah, no, for
This is
sure. Yeah, supply chains. It's so silly right now. So everything's 6 to 12 months away.
Yeah,
that's insane.
So talking about the foundation, maybe you could give us a brief overview, or the listeners a brief overview of the foundation, what the mission is, what you guys do. And obviously Frank Lloyd Wright was such a prominent figure and did so many different types of work. I have to imagine you guys have a lot of different programs and have to function in a lot of different ways.
We have a big challenge at the foundation. Some organizations, whether they're for-profit businesses, nonprofits, the challenge that they face is trying to figure out what to do. Our challenge is trying to figure out what not to do, because we have such a breadth in Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy. So a little background. Frank Lloyd Wright in 1940 formed the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation as a place to house not only the two properties that he were his homes and his studios, Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and Taliesin West, but also to house his architectural legacy, to form a basis on a nonprofit or tax-exempt basis for his apprenticeship program, which became known as the Taliesin Fellowship, started in 1932 and absorbed into the foundation in 1940. And the real purpose is set out in Frank Lloyd Wright's last will and testament is to perpetuate the teaching of organic architecture, and that would occur through the training of architects, as well as other work in the applied arts and related disciplines. So the foundation has existed for now 82 years to really perpetuate Frank Lloyd Wright's teachings. And I think it's really interesting that we focus on this work of perpetuation of the teachings, because it's not about creating a shrine to Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright really was, although he had a reputation for arrogance, he was really much more focused on how to impact the world through what he called organic architecture, and we can spend some time talking about that. But ultimately, for a man known for his ego, it felt less about him, and it feels less about him and more about the work that he was doing and how it would continue to evolve and grow even after his passing in 1959. So our mission as an organization is to bring this work, what we call an architecture for living, because it's not only about the architecture of buildings, it's about our relationship with nature, it's about our relationship with art and beauty, and our relationship with each other. It's to bring that to life for people, to discover it, to embrace it, and to improve the quality of their lives through this work called organic architecture, this sense of connection and continuity and integration where we exist, and the buildings that we design, and I don't mean the foundation, but we as people design as part of the larger scheme of the natural world.
That's really interesting. There's a lot of stuff to unpack already. I think the question of legacy for architects is fascinating on its own because a lot of offices, and obviously FLW is like an exception to everybody, but a lot of offices, they produce great work, and maybe there's one person leading the charge, and then when they pass away, their office ends. That's kind of it, and there's not much beyond that. And I think even just from the perspective of the career as an architect, the idea that toward, I guess when he founded the foundation, this 1940, he was like 70 something years old ish.
Not 19. So he was born in 1867. So in 1940, he would have been 73.
Yeah, right. And to think about legacy that way and have things continue on, not just through a school, but then through a foundation, I think is very intriguing. And I think maybe also that can only happen if the philosophy is like robust enough to have that occur. Like you were describing, It's not just about the building. It's not about shapes or just materials or physical things. It's about a larger kind of ethos in a way.
I think that's right. And, I think we tend first to know Frank Lloyd Wright through his buildings.
Yeah.
But if we look at the foundation's archives, the archives contain about 23,000 drawings. Now that is, considering this is before the age of CAD, that's a huge number of drawings. And considering this is before, we didn't have working drawing sets the way we have today. Often an entire building might be contained in a single drawing or 2 or 3 drawings, rather than dozens or hundreds of drawings, because a lot was left to interpretation by his apprentices working in the field to understand how to move from the 2-dimensional to the 3-dimensional. But in addition to the 23,000 drawings, there are 1.3 million other entries in the archive. There are writings, there are manuscripts, there are unpublished manuscripts, there are audiovisual materials, there's Sunday talks that he gave to the fellowship, there are lectures that he gave. We could go on and on for the next couple of hours, just starting to scratch the surface of the 1.3 million entries. And I think that's the real key here. When we look at Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy, it's not just a legacy of buildings that were actually constructed, buildings that were proposed but never constructed, but there's this legacy of ideas that extend not only to the architecture of buildings, but the architecture of society. They embrace questions about politics, immigration, social development, sustaining the natural environment, how the natural environment works, farming. There's this huge, rich legacy of ideas. I think it's funny. One of the things that I love, not being an architect, but coming into the architecture profession through this work, is the number of architects that create manifestos. And Wright didn't create a manifesto per se. He just left 1.3 million pages or 1.3 million documents to start a set of ideas and process that would grow beyond his lifetime. So for those that come out with their 1-page or, short little pamphlet style manifestos, you got work ahead of you if you want to compete with Frank Lloyd Wright.
That's cool, but check out 1.3 million entries. I think broadly speaking, this is, I guess the topic in a way is how architects communicate their principles, their ideas, and their designs to the larger public. And doing it through a manifesto or doing it in a way, or figuring a way to have an organization carry that on, after you pass is part of it. So it seems like a big part of the, considering the volume of entries and all the things you produce, it seems like a big part of the foundation would be almost just to make it accessible and to get people to understand all the things he did and all the things he said. Again, the communication aspect of the different things.
That's correct, David. I think there's this sense when we think about Frank Lloyd Wright's work of focusing on the past, and we certainly do have a lot of work that we do looking at the past. He, however, was forward-looking, and he did want his ideas to permeate the world. So you see in the early part of his career some really important early designs published in the Ladies' Home Journal. A small house for a prairie town is the precursor to the entire cross-axial plan prairie school style building. And it's published in the Ladies' Home Journal, not the architecture press, but the popular press. That's 1901 and 1903, if I'm forgive me if I'm not getting the dates exactly right. There's a lot to unpack there and a lot to remember with 1.3 million entries. But right after the turn of the century, he's in the popular press. He is a few years later going off to Europe to speak to other architects through what becomes known as the Wasmuth portfolio, which is a portfolio of his earliest designs. And we know from letters written, I think about a particular letter written by Richard Neutra about that portfolio showing up in Peter Barron's studio and just exploding everybody's ideas about what architecture could be and giving rise to what becomes European modernism, derived in no small measure from the work that's contained in Wright's Wasmuth portfolio from about 1910, 1911. And then he continues through his career to exhibit, to publish. He publishes his own books. He publishes little news pieces and essays called square papers through his career. He's constantly giving lectures. But the idea then was to set something in motion that would continue on its own, that it would outlive him. And I think that's something that's not a lot, in my experience, not so many architects are really doing that in the same way. They often talk to the trade, to the profession, but they're not necessarily talking to the general public and engaging the public. And I think that has to do with what we consider architecture. For Wright, architecture isn't buildings. Buildings are a form of architecture. But for Wright, it is this sense of continuity and connection with everything around us. You might think of architecture as an ecosystem in Wright's world. How we relate to the things around us and they relate to us. And we create these self-sustaining, we hope, if we do it well, they're self-sustaining models where everything grows and thrives through this sense of connection rather than competing in this destructive way for resource. That's going to change as society changes, and Wright is anticipating that by setting these principles in motion that outlive him and outlive his time, because they do provide this sense of timeless continuity with the world around us.
You know, the topic of architects communicating either just to their own trade or to the larger population, I think is a really important one. And maybe it's slightly off topic, but I do wish more architects put more effort or were better at communicating the profession, what they do, and their ideas to the larger public, because I think that bridging that gap, and I do perceive it as there's a gap, is I think an essential thing for the built environment as it gets evolved and as it gets advanced to advance in the right way. It tends to be we're very insular though, for whatever reason.
But I do think there's a role for cultural institutions like the foundation to play there, because architects are there's so many interests to compete in. The role of the architect seems to be continually diminished. If I compare Wright's time, when the architect had a very prominent role and very prominent say in building, to what happens today, where there's the property owner, there's the developer, there may be a manager, depending on the nature of the property, if it's commercial property. There's so many layers of management of the end product that intervene between the architect's vision and the finished product, that voice gets diluted. And in Wright's time, there was this better platform for the architect to speak directly and to have their vision realized more directly than can happen today. And so I think cultural institutions now have to play a role. One of the things that we love to do at the foundation is to bring architects in to conversation with the general public, not just with other architects, but with the communities that they're working in, with the people that they are serving, be it end clients, potential clients, the developer community, to talk about the future of design as it relates to the evolution of the community around them and around their work. And I think having that outlet, that place for a really critical exchange, so that the architect isn't just focused solely on the client and that group that I described, the developer, the builder, but also the larger community in which the building exists. I think that's critically important for architecture to be successful. If it's not, otherwise you get these one-off pieces that don't relate to each other, that don't look necessarily at the sustainability of a design or the sustainability of a community, because they're just being built, to serve a very short-term specific need. Architecture can serve a much bigger purpose when there's that communication with the community, and cultural institutions provide a wonderful, wonderful forum for that type of dialogue to occur.
I really love that framing. That's very, very interesting, the role of the cultural institution in that way. That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that you had also kind of touched on was the idea of the past and the present and the future. And obviously Frank Lloyd Wright, it still blows my mind. And I think we talked with you about this, that he was born in 1867.
3 years after the Civil War.
That, I can't comprehend how long ago that was, and for the work he did. I don't understand it.
We actually talked about it in a previous recording with an architectural photographer, and we were like, was he some sort of alien, because he was just so ahead in his thinking, and the idea that came out, at the time he was living in, it just seems like, was that guy from the future? Was he there to just bring us a message of some sort?
Yeah. I gotta tell you, if he had been around for it, I'm convinced that his favorite song would have been Fleetwood Mac, "Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow," because that's really what he was doing. It's funny because he's born 3 years after the Civil War. So think of, and he's born in a rural farm community outside of Madison, Wisconsin. So he's born in an era of horses and buggies and buggy whips, and the Transcontinental Railroad is a brand new thing. There aren't automobiles, there aren't airplanes, there aren't telephones, there isn't electricity. And he dies a couple of years after Sputnik is launched. So he literally goes from the horse and buggy age to the space age. And think about the range of social development that occurs during that period. Everything from the changing role of women in society, the waves of immigration in America, the opportunity for travel, the emergence of a middle class, and important, although it seems sort of quaint today, the emergence of the servantless house, and all these things. The automobile is such a critical factor, especially in the last 30 years or so of his career, because the automobile changes the scale for social mobility, professional mobility, and social development for so many people. And he starts to design the entire scheme of not only individual buildings, but plans and cities and thought experiments like Broadacre City around the automobile. So he is never one to really look back and rest on his laurels. He is always looking forward because he feels this urgent need to prepare the way for the future, and to help create that future and shape it in a productive and healthy way. There aren't many careers like that. When I was taking this job, literally the day that I accepted the offer 6 years ago was the day that David Bowie died. I was up all night thinking to myself, what am I doing taking on the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation? It's only one of the world's great cultural legacies that I could screw up, so there's no pressure in that. And debating whether to take it. And news of David Bowie's passing came over, and and I thought to myself, there's actually a bit of a parallel there. These are people that embrace the new, that were not afraid to challenge even the things that they had done before in order to do something newer, bolder, different. And they loved taking on risk, and they applied everything that they encountered. They synthesized all of this information into an ongoing intellectual framework in their heads, and then that spit out as their artwork in these really bold, innovative ways to create something that would get us to think differently about our place in the world. And I love that. And it was really thinking about David Bowie and his career that gave me a bit of confidence to do what I'm doing, leading the foundation now, because I saw these parallels and I thought, who are the next people that are going to be like Frank Lloyd Wright and David Bowie? And how can we use the platform of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, not just to celebrate Frank Lloyd Wright's work, but to create the space for people to think differently about the future and to engage through these ideas and to help them synthesize what their experience of the world is into these new and bold ways. That's part of the reason why I'm here.
That's really interesting, because I think it's very easy to look at a foundation like yours, and I think of it purely from the perspective of preservation, right? And in the past, so to speak, like you're preserving this thing, you're crystallizing, you're maintaining it.
Well, it's an easier job too.
Still, yeah,
sure.
But that's in a way, I guess, almost antithetical, very different from being the futurist that Frank Lloyd Wright was, or the mission statement that you just outlined of helping find the new or bolster the new David Bowie, the new Frank Lloyd Wright. So how do you guys do that, though? How do you support or catalyze, however you would frame it, things for the future as opposed to only preservation?
Sure. Well, let's actually start with preservation.
Sure.
And I'll say that when I got to the foundation, what I found in both our mission statement at the time, which was focused on the preservation of the two properties as an end unto itself. I think that's a really important point to make. But what I found was this very insular organization that saw its role as protecting the past. And I found both parts of that statement really problematic. First, let's focus on the past, because Wright was forward-looking, and I couldn't think of a greater injustice to his legacy and to his entire life than to take a man who was always not only forward-looking but helping to shape the future, and to lock him up in amber and point him backwards.
Right.
And that's sort of what had happened. And I think Wright deserved and deserves much more than that. But this notion of protection, there had developed at the foundation over many decades, there had developed a sense of orthodoxy about what we want to say about Frank Lloyd Wright. My background's in law. I've practiced law for a couple of decades, and I'm a huge Frank Lloyd Wright enthusiast. That's why I'm here. But say my professional career is in law, and law is this evolutionary thing. It recognizes that the law has to change over time. I know there's a couple of Supreme Court justices that'll disagree with that, but the law has to change over time to respond to the needs of society. And Wright also saw the architecture and the principles of architecture as responding to the evolving needs and changes of society and the world around us. So how could we then establish an orthodoxy for something that by its definition, by the definition of its creator, Frank Lloyd Wright, was intended to change over time? So we very quickly abandoned all notions of orthodoxy. I love heterodoxy. I think the role of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and I'll go so far as to say the role of any cultural institution, is to create a space for dialogue, for an exchange of ideas, and not only ideas among present scholars and enthusiasts and participants, but also a dialogue between past, or among past, present, and future. And our preservation could then be harnessed to help us to shape that dialogue. So we don't preserve the buildings as an end unto itself. Sure, we want to keep them around, but we also preserve the buildings because we know that they provide an experience that you can't get reading about Frank Lloyd Wright's work, seeing images of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. It's just not possible to fully understand Wright without being in his spaces and getting that sense of place that exists within his spaces. But the two Taliesin's in particular were also created as unfinished works. They remain unfinished works, and they will always remain unfinished works because he creates them as laboratories with the intention to change and evolve these spaces as our needs of society, as available materials and technology move forward. So that our preservation has very much a forward-looking experimental focus in the work. Around that, we then start to build programs. For many decades, the foundation had the fellowship as its focus to, and a practice after Wright's death, it became known as Taliesin Architects, but a practice of the architects trained by Frank Lloyd Wright to continue to apply the teachings of organic architecture to new buildings, new works that they were creating, and to train new architects through an apprenticeship program. In 1986, that becomes an accredited school. In 2017, the school becomes independent of the foundation. But that was the way that that work was being perpetuated, was through the training of architects. Mm. We've just announced a new program this week called the Taliesin Institute that will go back to the principles of the original fellowship, bring people in, whether they're students in architecture programs, whether they're practitioners, whether they're cognitive scientists or artists, composers, writers, scholars, to come learn from the spaces themselves, because the spaces are remarkable teaching tools, remarkable ways to understand Frank Lloyd Wright's principles of integration and continuity between the built environment and the natural landscape, and to affect people's thinking, not just through the buildings, but also by bringing people together from disparate fields in conversation with each other and with the buildings and with the ideas represented in the buildings to help the development of the field of architecture itself, and in turn, the development of society through design thinking, through this sense of continuity and integration with the landscape, with the world around us, that's essential to our future, never more essential than it is today. All the concerns about climate change and other factors that we sort of bottle up into the notion of sustainability. Well, that's all being addressed in Wright's work. And how is it addressed today? Through contemporary thought leadership. That's the work of the foundation too. And then bringing that to the general public. People often don't like the word museum. And I know there are a lot of people associated with the foundation, its past, that really hate the word museum. They say Wright never intended for these properties to be museums. But if museums are these places for dialogue, not just a collection of objects, but places for dialogue and exchange, then the work of a museum that brings these ideas to the general public, and as we talked about a few minutes ago, brings contemporary architects and thought leaders into conversation with the general public. Well, that helps us to shape society in the same way that Frank Lloyd Wright was doing through those early publications, through the Ladies' Home Journal, through the Bosma portfolio, through the many books that he published.
The broader mission of the foundation, as you described it, is really clear. But what I really like is that you seem to have a very good it always makes sense, you're the president, a very good understanding that to address or to solve it requires doing different things under different avenues, right? And because it's a very complex problem, despite it being very clearly stated as you made it.
Well, and Wright embraces complexity in his work, so his foundation should do the same. This is why we also recognize that there's only so much that we can do on our own, but the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation lives within an ecosystem of 73 or 74 other Frank Lloyd Wright organizations. Oh, really? Some of them run a house museum in Silverton, Oregon, or the Guggenheim Museum has a Frank Lloyd Wright component, of course, to it as well in their work. Some are larger organizations like the Frank Lloyd Wright Trust in Chicago that interacts with a series of Frank Lloyd Wrights building there in the community of Oak Park. And the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, a fantastic partner organization to us that works with individual homeowners on their needs, as well as some of the smaller public sites. So together we get to support this Frank Lloyd Wright legacy and bring it to the public in all of its various manifestations through his built works. But then you have Columbia University and the Museum of Modern Art, which now hold the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation archive. And they're making that work available to scholars on a scale that could never have happened when those archives were being held at Taliesin West. The number of scholarly inquiries has gone up, I think, by a factor of 10 since the archives were transferred. Again, an extraordinary opportunity for us. And then other partner organizations, whether they're universities, whether they're other museums, whether they're individual architecture practices, and those that contribute to thought leadership as we consider the built environment. It's with government entities that we interact with to bring rights ideas to bear on problems that communities face today. So we don't do this alone. We really do establish, and it's why I keep coming back to this word ecosystem, an ecosystem of contributors who look to rights work, not, again, as an orthodoxy, not as, inherently providing answers, but providing a framework for discussion that teaches us how we can be a part of the world around us in a productive, healthy, thriving way.
That's great. I think fundamentally viewing the legacy and all the things we discussed as a framework, as you just put it, that's fundamentally different from saying I have this artifact, whether it be a building or a writing or even a school or whatever it might be. And again, crystallizing it and saying, that's it. We're just here to preserve and show as many people as possible. Those are very, very different takes.
Indeed. And Wright, again, I always have to start our work through the lens of what Wright did, because I think, even when I was developing the new strategic plan when I got here, ultimately I came back to the fact that Frank Lloyd Wright knew what his foundation should be doing, and we largely have gone back to his principles. So he was engaging the public in all of these different ways. He was engaging the profession. He was engaging thought leaders. He was engaging business leaders and civic leaders. So why would we not do that? But we have constrained resources, so we know we cannot do that on our own. And that's why we formed these partnerships.
Going back to talking about you a little bit, so how did you get how did you get to where you are today? Because you're not an architect, you're right. I mean, you like you said, you came from a very different background. So how did you get parachuted into the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation?
Some days I think it's dumb luck. Other days, maybe a little bit of a curse. But I grew up in Chicago, and I was part of a really interesting education program that began in my elementary school that was not for traditional learners and not traditional learning. We did spend some time in classrooms, but we spent a lot of time going on field trips. And those field trips could be going to a museum, going to a zoo, but it wasn't the usual passive experience. We would be exposed to these cultural resources in a deeper way, with project-based learning coming out of these field trips. And we'd also go to field trips to Fermilab, one of the leading physics laboratories in the world, to start learning about physics when we're 8, 9, 10 years old too. And it was self-directed learning. And one of the early field trips that I went on was a field trip to look at Chicago architecture. And this is, I think, back in 1971. The Chicago Architecture Foundation was fairly new at the time. The whole historic preservation movement in Chicago was fairly new after a couple of Key Louis Sullivan buildings, the Garrick Theater, also known as the Schiller Building, and then the Chicago Stock Exchange building were demolished in the name of progress. Very quickly, I learned that preservation was not progress. And so we got to go on this field trip in downtown Chicago, and we walked into the Rookery Building, one of the great works of Chicago architecture, the lobby of which had been redesigned by Frank Lloyd Wright. Boy, I should know this year, and I just off the top of my head can't think of it. And it was subsequently redesigned by one of Wright's colleagues, William Drummond. And by the time I'm seeing it in 1971, it's a disaster. This beautiful skylight has been covered with lead. There's peeling paint. Things are just in awful shape. And yet still somehow the sense of space and the sense of light within that space was so radically different than anything that I had ever seen. It captured my imagination. So I go back to school, and my project is going to be to do some drawings and create a small model of the Rookery Building and talk about what I learned and why it inspired me. And my teacher, a woman named Belle Willans, was the first of many very bright teachers who told me that I didn't have much in the way of drawing talent. They were kinder than that. They were encouraging. I don't want to make it sound like she was this horrible teacher. She's a great teacher. But the career in architecture was very clearly not probably going to be a part of my future, because even to this day, I have no drawing talent. And this is long before computer aided design. But I did, with anything that captured my imagination as a kid, I would immediately go to the library and check out every book that I could find on the thing that was capturing my imagination. And not only was I captivated by Frank Lloyd Wright's designs, but I was also captivated by his life. Here was a farm kid from Wisconsin who was a high school dropout, 1 year of college, who was going on to revolutionize the world. 100 years after his birth, there we were touring his buildings and talking about him. And there were whole, shelves of books about this guy. And as a working class kid, part of what I took away from that is that if you apply your intelligence and your talent, and everybody has it, and if you apply your intelligence and talent to something, you have an opportunity to change the world. So he also inspired something that I carry forward today, which is this belief that we can have an impact on the world. That's what he set out to have as a young man from rural Wisconsin. And, time will tell if I have had an impact on the world or not. I hope so. And hopefully it's a good impact. But he really inspired me to see the world in a different way and see my role in the world in a different way. I have then spent the next 50 years. I was an 8-year-old boy when I first encountered him. I'm 58 now. So I've spent a half century reading, studying, visiting his buildings, learning about other architects. His work introduced me to the field of architecture, which I just love. But his architecture and his sense of making not only buildings, but making us an integral part of the world around us just has been my life's focus. So I went on to engineering school, took as many elective courses as I could in art history and architectural history. Did what a lot of people did in the early 1980s when I decided not to practice engineering. And anybody who got a degree that they weren't going to use in the early 1980s went to law school, and I was one of them. And I practiced law in Chicago and had occasion, because the law firm that I was with had a large architecture and construction practice. So I had occasion to interacts with architects and architecture and builders through the law practice. My focus was intellectual property, so patents, trademarks, copyrights, related creative works. And I love that opportunity to spend the early part of my career working with creative professionals, innovators, designers. Since I didn't have that talent myself, I could help nurture their talent, and I could help ensure that their work would be sustained by creating space through intellectual property law for their work to thrive, to secure additional funding, to be resourced. In a capitalist system, you've got to, at the end of the day, creative work so often isn't supported unless it can be made profitable. And my work could help do that. But it could also help the community in other ways. And I served on a lot of boards, did a lot of volunteer work through law school. I was a docent at the Chicago Architecture Foundation, giving the same kind of tour that I took as an 8-year-old boy to other people. That was my sanity through law school. And without going through the rest of the corporate career, by 2015, I had pretty much accomplished not only what I wanted to do as a lawyer, as a global business leader, but I had also had an opportunity to spend enough time in the nonprofit sector as a board member, as a volunteer, to know that that's what I wanted to do. So having accomplished my professional goals, I wanted to see how I could contribute in the nonprofit space. And I didn't expect it to be in the arts or architecture. I actually thought it would be in human services. I had occasion to do some litigation on behalf of the community affected by AIDS and HIV to ensure that they had coverage for their needs and also other disabled people to have insurance coverage for their needs the same way that the rest of us could have health insurance. As I'm saying that, I realize that we live in America and there's way too many people that don't have health insurance, but that was a different and remains a different problem that I would still love to tackle, but I couldn't do anything about that. But we could prevent discrimination against disabled people. We could do some other work on behalf of indigent people, homeless people, kids who weren't getting access to health care. And I thought that's what I would do in my nonprofit part of my career. And then while having dinner with a friend in Philadelphia who happens to be the foundation's intellectual property lawyer, I was talking about the fact that to make this career change, I had to write a new resume, and I haven't written a resume in many years. And it's hard to write a resume if you haven't written one in many years. It's insurmountably hard. And my friend Lynn said to me, well, what if the perfect job came along, like head of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation? And I said, why would they hire me? And that's odd to pluck out of thin air. And she said, well, they're my clients and they're looking for a new CEO. And what they need is someone who really understands strategy, who understands fundraising, who understands financial management, and who understands Frank Lloyd Wright's role. And that's you. And I think you'd be great at it. So if nothing else, I figured it would give me that chance to apply, to write a resume and for the nonprofit space. And something from my legal career must have stuck because I persuaded the board that was doing the search to hire a guy who had never run a nonprofit, wasn't an architect, wasn't an art historian, wasn't a museum leader, to do all those things. And so I'm persuasive at some level, and I would like to believe that I've brought those disciplines to the foundation. And 6 years later, it's 6 years ago, February 1st, that I joined the foundation. We're now in the best financial shape that we've ever been. We've done a lot more work to preserve the buildings and the landscapes. We've gotten the 2 properties and 6 other Frank Lloyd Wright properties onto the World Heritage List in partnership with some of the other organizations that I mentioned. We've accomplished a lot, and I'd like to believe it's because of the the strategic focus that I've tried to bring to the foundation, and then bringing on staff and using the existing staff resources. We've got some great leaders to accomplish all that work.
Well, that's a fantastic story. I think, one of the things I was wondering about is it would seem like on paper that maybe your background prior to joining the foundation would almost be ideal for the foundation, because I don't know why I think that. I mean, maybe this is a generalization and an assumption, but I think that from the nonprofits I have seen, it's very easy for the leaders of nonprofits to be people who started it with the social or cultural mission in mind. Great, but they don't have an understanding of what it means to essentially run a business, make a profit, but not make a profit, but earn money to drive the nonprofit, to structure things, to strategize. So I would imagine that all of that background would be very applicable and helpful.
I think there's a lot of talk about bringing good business practice into the nonprofit sphere. And I think there is a place for that. But that conversation that's occurring, and it's been occurring for about a decade or so, misses the fact that there's a lot from the nonprofit space and the notion of being a mission-driven organization that needs to move back to the for-profit sphere. What I could bring, I think, was this fresh set of eyes, and in some ways the advantage of the novice's approach, not being an architectural historian, but being curious about this work, not being an architect, but being an enthusiast and being curious about this work. Maybe that gives me some insight into how we can inspire curiosity of others to come and work with us and learn about this work. I think there's I can't remember the author, but there's some books of Buddhist thought, Beginner's Mind, Novice's Mind, that I have looked to over the years. I'm a deep believer in really approaching things in that way. What is it? It's easy to talk about what you know. It's really hard to talk about what you don't know. But everything that you're going to accomplish is going to really be done through the lens of what you don't know. How you approach what you don't know, how you acquire knowledge, skill, doing that directly, doing that through partnership is critical. What's been interesting in the for-profit sphere is that businesses that used to be fully integrated, they did their manufacturing and their distribution and their sales effort, have now broken that out into networks of specialized participants in their work. You no longer see businesses that own all their own trucks and do everything from start to finish. There are some, but fewer and fewer. More look to networks and synergies gained through networks in order to accomplish what they're trying to do in the world. And I think that kind of thinking is really starting to take shape in the nonprofit world as well. The other thing I want to say is this. We don't give nonprofit leaders, nonprofit workers, cultural workers nearly enough credit. When I want to do some market research, I have to go out and find funding for it. I have to, and I can tell you, not a lot of donors are enthusiastic, to put money into audience research. There are some. We got a wonderful grant from the Virginia Piper Trust here in Arizona to support that kind of research. Doing that at Newell Rubbermaid when I was an executive there, sure, we had to find the budget for it, but that was sort of an assumption, a given. You're going to just do that, right? You have to do that market research periodically. Nonprofit leaders have to be so resourceful. They have to be so diligent and so energized, and to energize the people around them to get their work done, because the resource constraints are even greater. I haven't met anybody who says they have unlimited resources to do their work. So everybody believes they operate within resource constraints, and they do. But in the nonprofit space, the resources can be so constrained, and the success, the brilliant work that's done in the cultural sector by these nonprofit leaders with their constrained resources, it never ceases to amaze me. I am so humbled by the work of the people all around me in the cultural space, and just seeing what they do with often so very little. And the same thing's true outside the cultural sector in the nonprofit space too.
That's fascinating. There's one specific point you made which caught my attention. A lot of things you said actually, but one of them was that the for-profit sector taking a cue from nonprofits and having a mission, and that actually has for sure become a trend. You can see it quite clearly. A lot of businesses that are for-profit, it's almost now, if you're a new business, you have to have a mission. If you don't, it's just people, consumers or clients or whoever are not going to believe in it or buy into it. And I think this is getting off topic in a way, but I think that's a general shift for all businesses and all organizations like that, is you have to have a legitimate and honest reason for what you're doing. Otherwise, the general public won't buy into it.
I don't know if you're familiar with the work of, and I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but Simon Sinek.
Yeah, Simon
Sinek.
Yeah.
Yep. So The Golden Circle, his great TED Talk on why, Joey Reitman's book on purpose, and the work that he did at Bright House, I think is really extraordinary in that way. And, we can even bring this back into Frank Lloyd Wright, because Wright was, in fact, his goal was not to build buildings. His goal was to change the world. He spoke, and it's a really great interview that you can find on YouTube, interview with Mike Wallace in the 50s. He spoke about wanting to create an architecture worthy of the Declaration of Independence, the center line of freedom, an architecture of its time and place for its time and place, and that this was a better way to live. And he was fundamentally trying to change the way that people lived. He was also trying to create an architecture that cast off preconceived notions. And I'm not just talking architecture of buildings, I'm talking a social architecture that cast off preconceived notions inherited from Europe, principally, and looked at the construction, the design of American society, beginning, I would say, with transcendental thought in the early part of the 19th century, that was emerging from our landscape, that embraced ideas found in Darwin and Emerson, Thoreau, the pragmatism, the quintessentially American pragmatism of John Dewey. This was his mission. And he said the mission of an architect is to make life more beautiful, the world a better one for living in, and to give rhyme, reason, and meaning to life. If you want to find that manifesto, it's that one sentence that I think inspires the entire body of Wright's work, his built work and his writings, and his exhibitions and his speeches. It's all about making the world a better place, a better one for living in, a world that connects us as part of, I don't even want to say it connects us as part of nature. I realize I've been using that, but I'm going to say it differently. A world that recognizes that we are a part of nature. And just as nature is this interconnected ecosystem, we recognize our role in that ecosystem through what we do, through what we build, and how we live.
I can imagine if I had written that and then pinning up on a wall, that'd be quite the statement to live up to. My goodness. Okay. Yeah. That's why I produced 1 million.
Yeah, he didn't set a small task for himself.
Yeah,
David.
No kidding. That's funny. I also want to talk about, because you had mentioned that there are 73 total or 72 other organizations.
Yeah, 70. Either 73 or 74 in total.
Okay. And you guys are one of them. So is there not one organization that's like on top of everyone else and everyone else is underneath that umbrella? Or is it everyone really is separate and you guys have to, I don't know how it works, have a big roundtable meeting once a year with 73 people and decide?
Yeah, we do every other year. We have a site directors meeting that gets about 30 or so of the site directors together. the Johnson Foundation up at SC Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
We meet at a house that Wright designed for the president of SC Johnson, a house called Wingspread.
Yeah.
Every other year, and we get the site directors and we talk about common challenges. But this really is a distributed ecosystem. Wright loved democracy, and this is a democracy. Everybody gets to sort of do their own thing. But the role that we've tried to stake out at the foundation, recognizing that we have not only the body of resources that Wright gifted us through his will, the intellectual property, the intellectual legacy, so to speak, the drawings, the archives, et cetera, but also that we have more visitors than many of the other sites, more financial resources than some of the other sites. So we try to see ourselves as the first among equals. And our job as the first among equals is not to tell everybody what to do, but to be underneath them, to be the rising tide for them as much as possible, and to lift them up. So we have, for example, a licensing program that licenses Frank Lloyd Wright's intellectual property. And this is everything from museum store tchotchkes to a beautiful line that we launched last year, inspired by Wright's principles of bathroom fittings.
With Brizo.
With Brizo, and you talked to Judd Lord about that last year. So when we, for example, if we take a light fixture from the Roby House and we license that so people can bring Wright's designs into their home, then a portion of what we receive a royalty for that, and a portion of that royalty is actually given to the Frank Lloyd Wright Trust in Chicago to help them with their programming. So we established this gain sharing model several years ago to be that rising tide. We have a social media following that's much larger than the social media following of, I think, all the other Wright sites combined. So when they're doing new programs, when they have news to share about something going on in their building, some restoration work that they've done, well, let's share that with our audience so that these Wright enthusiasts who follow our social media get to see what's happening, and hopefully, whether they visit the site, whether they make a financial contribution to these other sites, especially if they're in their own community, we hope that they'll make a financial contribution to sustain those buildings and those organizations in their own community. Well, that should be the work of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, to help lift this entire legacy up, and then to partner with these other organizations in this heterodoxy, in this dialogue, this conversation that's taking place about Wright's legacy today and its relevance in communities all across this country and around the world.
You know, talking about intellectual property, again, it seems to be quite clear that in some cases you have an artifact, and embedded within that is intellectual property, and you show it to people for a ticket price and whatnot. But then, and this brings up Brizo specifically, I suppose, there are these other moments where you guys almost do kind of like a collaboration with another designer or company or whatnot. How often do those happen? And is that difficult to do? Is that met with resistance even? Because again, that's a very different take.
It is a radically different take, and it's a radically different take on the licensing program for the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. Historically, we confined our work to replica.
Yeah.
So you could buy from Cassina, you could buy a replica of the Taliesin West origami chair. And you could buy a coaster that has a Frank Lloyd Wright design on it. So we would literally apply I use the products at home, I admit, and I love this work. So it's but again, if this legacy is forward-looking, if these principles are intended to move beyond what was done in the past, and that's what Wright says in his will, it's about perpetuating the teaching of organic architecture and its principles, then simply replicating the past is at odds with the intention of our founder, and I would say at odds with the thrust of his career and his whole reason that we still think about him today. So we started to look for partners several years ago who would be able to move beyond merely replicating the past and who could really think about these principles. And Brizo is a great case in point. Through my business career, I know a lot of executives at a lot of companies in the consumer products and building product space. And I contacted one of them who was at Brizo at the time, and that person introduced me to Judd at the KBiz show in Orlando in 2017. I actually sent a note to Judd saying, hey, it's 5 years ago that we met at the KBiz show in Orlando. And Judd and I began talking about this opportunity, and I said, there are no Frank Lloyd Wright designed faucets. There are no Frank Lloyd Wright designed bathroom fittings. So if we do something, we need to do something from first principles. And that's a big, tall order. And he said, we at Brizo had approached the foundation soon after the Brizo brand was founded and I have some concept sketches that I want to show you. And what was supposed to be a 15-minute meet and greet turned into a meeting that we both think lasted several hours because we were both geeking out on Frank Lloyd Wright's designs. And the concept sketches that Judd showed me that day were actually pretty good. They actually are very close to what the finished product looked like. But we then began an education sharing with the team from Brizo. They came out to Taliesin West. We did some training on Wright's principles. We showed them how different things work in Frank Lloyd Wright's world, the sense of continuity and connection, the use of, and I think this is just a really lovely point illustrated in the Brizo product. So everybody should go check this out on the Brizo website, or better yet, in the showroom. But the use of balance as opposed to symmetry, because Wright rejects formal symmetry very often in favor of balance, since that's what you usually find in the natural world at a macro scale is much more of a balanced approach than a symmetrical approach. And so working from those principles and embracing the spirit of innovation that characterized Wright's career, Brizo came forward with these beautiful designs, and we approved the final designs, and then we started all over again on the marketing campaign, and we educated the marketing team. I literally delivered hundreds of pages of reading about Frank Lloyd Wright's work and his ideas to the marketing team, to the advertising agency, and to the PR agency. And we had hours and hours of calls. And then they came back with a creative campaign that was brilliant. And I looked at my marketing guru at the time, and at the time that we got this in, and I said, they got it much better than you do, Jeff. And he agreed. They really captured it well, and so we were just really excited about that. And we're doing that now with others. We have some things that we'll be announcing later this year that because they're public companies, we can't talk about it yet. But we've got some really exciting things moving ahead. Some of which is replica. We haven't abandoned replica work, but we also are looking at some really innovative new design, we say inspired by Wright's work. And it's inspired by the principles as much as it's inspired by pre-existing works adapted for our time, because we want this legacy to be living. We did a project with Lindell Homes, called their Inspire series, that are based on several of Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian works, his Usonian houses, but adapted for the needs of our time. And then, realizing something that Wright was trying to do, which is to make these beautiful houses, these beautiful ways to live, more affordable, more democratic. And Lindell, has done a great job with that. So even when it comes to, some designs of houses, they're not Frank Lloyd Wright designs. We want to clearly articulate that these are not Frank Lloyd Wright houses. Yeah. Only Frank Lloyd Wright could build a Frank Lloyd Wright house. But to have his principles being applied in a very direct manner under the supervision of the foundation, so that we, have that not only that authenticity, but that integrity to his principles. That's really an important part of our work today, so that this legacy remains living, thriving, and relevant today and in the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Have you ever been approached by someone who wanted to partner with you guys for something like really crazy?
Like what?
I don't know.
Every week, Marina. Every week. We often get approached to build unbuilt works, or to build works that were demolished, like the Larkin building.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can't do that anymore. The Taliesin architects did that kind of work for many years. They allowed unbuilt works to be constructed. And there's a number of them all over the country.
That's interesting.
The foundation before I got here adopted a policy, and then we not only refined that policy, but we also worked with the Society of Architectural Historians and with the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy to really articulate a set of principles, not just for Frank Lloyd Wright's work, but for the unbuilt works of other architects. Because, look, the plans, like I said, the working drawings were not like a set of construction drawings today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There was too much room left for interpretation, and Wright trusted the people that he personally trained to interpret his work, but not others. Second thing is that to meet building codes, you would have to change the designs.
Yeah.
Because certain materials are no longer available, you'd have to change the design. So now we're already moving even further away from Wright's work. And the last thing is that his works were designed in a very site-specific manner, not only for the site, but the orientation to and integration with the site. So as soon as you build it somewhere else, you have to change the design. So we just got out of that business, and we want to encourage people, if you really want to, put a lot of money into a Frank Lloyd Wright design, there are needy buildings all over this country. And so invest in preserving Wright's work. If you want to build a new building with the principles of organic architecture, there are really amazing architects. And I don't want to sound like I'm fawning here, but looking at the work that you're doing in your practice, and honestly, if you're going to build a new building, and hire a really talented architect and help nurture the next Frank Lloyd Wright, help their careers grow and thrive. Wright, even for his apprentices, he was very clear. He didn't want them to regurgitate his designs. There's often this misleading notion that when we talk about designing with the principles of organic architecture, that means make a building that looks like Frank Lloyd Wright's building. But Wright wanted everybody to find their own voice. That's part of the democratic nature of his architecture. And so take his principles, but put that through the lens of your experience, your talent, the way you see the world, and create your own building using his ideas, using his principles. And it's going to look nothing like his. And he was very clear with his apprentices that when they're working on his buildings, they should look like his buildings. But when they're working on their own buildings, they should look different. He didn't have much use for people that left the fellowship and tried to design knockoff Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. But he loved the work of architects like John Lautner. He loved the work of people like Alden Dow, although he didn't love it when Alden Dow got the Phoenix Art Museum commission in his, in Wright's own backyard. He felt that should have been his. But, he loved their work. He celebrated their work. And he loved the work of other designers that were expressing modernism in their own way. He had this great friendship with Mies van der Rohe. So why wouldn't we, and he enjoyed the work. It looks nothing like his. In many respects, it's antithetical to Wright's a lot of Wright's principles, particularly the whole question of spirituality in the buildings. Wright didn't see it in anything that was, in the international style. He thought it was devoid of spirituality. Yet he still respected the architect's authentic voice and their desire to express this relationship with the world around them through their own unique vocabulary. He just didn't want the copycats. So how can we encourage people who come to us to do these strange projects to find it in their, to find their own voice. And the Brizo project, I think, is a good example. The design team there working with Judd found their own voice through Frank Lloyd Wright's principles, and they produced beautiful, beautiful products.
And of course, it's much more difficult to do it that way as opposed to just copying something. That's the trick.
That's absolutely right. That's why it took 4 years to bring that Brizo product to life.
Yeah, yeah. And I could see where you and Judd would have a conversation for multiple hours. I think anyone can talk to Judd for multiple hours. He's
we're both a little verbose.
And this is also an interesting distinction, when you were talking about building the unbuilt work that he had designed, that because of all the reasons you listed, that when it would get constructed, there's something kind of perverse about it, because it's real, but it's not real, and you don't really know where the changes have been made. And I think for some people, they could, hear that or see that and say, well, isn't that the same thing as doing faucets in the manner of Frank Lloyd Wright or inspired by him? But it's not actually.
Well, yeah, it's not. I mean, to me, it's like if you ask, like you had a Picasso who did a napkin sketch, and you ask someone now to finish his painting,
right.
There's so much of the creator's involvement into realizing the piece that no one else could really finish it the way they would. So what's the point then?
Yeah, as opposed to learning from their philosophy.
Yeah, at some point, I think
that's a. Go ahead, Marina.
I was going to say, I think at some point you kind of have to recognize where to stop being a fan of somebody, and just kind of like, looking back at the work and looking and dissecting the principles instead of just getting attached to the artifact.
Right.
Well, one of the interesting things that we, say about bringing people to our campuses to learn from the campuses is that they need to be on campus long enough to get over the fact that they're in a Frank Lloyd Wright building. The celebrity, the starchitect power distorts what they are observing. And when they get bored with the Frank Lloyd Wright factor, the buildings and their connection to the landscape, the use of materials really open up and reveal themselves in a way that is obscured by Frank Lloyd Wright's celebrity. So as we look at the work of the Taliesin Institute coming up, we'll have one-day programs for people, one-day programs for professionals, but we're also going to have week and multi-week and for students semester-long programs that will allow people to get over the Frank Lloyd Wright factor and just immerse themselves in Frank Lloyd Wright's principles. And that's going to be extraordinary. As someone who spent, let's say, half a century looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's work, reading his principles, when I started to work on his campuses every day, and I lived at Taliesin West for the first 3 months of my tenure here, a few weeks in, I just saw things in his work and gained an understanding that a half century of study never offered me. And that's what we want to make available to people in the future through these programs, is that opportunity for immersion, to see what's there. Judd and the design team at Brizo, did that. And there are people who call that out and say, that doesn't feel very Frank Lloyd Wright to me. There are people who will say that about some of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings too.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And some of the buildings that were, that came after Wright's death, but that were constructed by Taliesin architects. Monona Terrace in Wisconsin, there are a lot of people, because Wright only developed an exterior plan for it. The interior was designed by one of his apprentices, Tony Putnam. And I've heard people say that building feels like a soulless version, a non-spiritual version of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And other people say, wow, this is what, Wright clearly would have done. Well, we have no idea what Wright would have done.
Yeah.
He was a genius. I haven't met too many geniuses. I'm certainly not a genius about design. So I can't tell you what Frank Lloyd Wright would have done. But what we can try to do is to use his principles and get them out there and perpetuate them through practice. And that's what we're doing. And some will love it, and some will think that it's false. The Brizo product is articulated in the marketing campaign through 6 principles of organic architecture. And out in one of the social media groups, somebody said, there aren't 6 principles of organic architecture. What are you talking about? Someone else said, well, here's Wright's essay where he talks about these 6 principles of organic architecture. And this guy who was complaining about it actually went so far as to say, well, I've read that and I just don't agree.
Okay, well,
so there are the people that know Frank Lloyd Wright better than Frank Lloyd Wright. Yeah. God bless them. Yeah. If this inspires their passion and their commitment to this legacy, then come on into the conversation.
Yeah, we start to get into, I think, weird territory when someone's looking at something that was or was not done by Frank Lloyd Wright, and you say it is like him, it's not like him. It gets into strange areas, I feel like. And the reality is, as you said, we don't know. No one really knows, you know. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, well, anyway, I don't know how productive sometimes that kind of stuff is.
I don't know if you've ever been to there's a pair of sites, because one of the sites has multiple buildings on it, but in Buffalo, New York, you've got the Darwin Martin complex, which is many people consider the greatest work of the Prairie School. Wright called it the magnum opus, and it is remarkable, and it's been beautifully restored. And just south in Derby, New York, there is a house built for the same family, the Martin family, called Graycliff. The Darwin Martin house is built for the industrial magnate who's running the Larkin Soap Company. A couple of decades later, Graycliff is built for his wife, who is losing her eyesight, and it's built around her needs. And it actually tells a really beautiful emotional story, these two sites together. But we just had the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy Conference last fall in Buffalo, and there are these Frank Lloyd Wright enthusiasts, and they go to Graycliff and they say, this just doesn't feel very Frank Lloyd Wright to me. And I think Graycliff is one of the most brilliant articulations of Wright's design principles, because he stripped away a lot of the of ornamentation, of a lot of his tricks and techniques, so that the building speaks to the site, the light, and the integrity of materials themselves. There's nothing else there. That's all there really is at Graycliff. And the house works wonderfully. So I understand for the people that want the leaded glass and, and the things that you see up at the Darwin Martin house, Graycliff is the antithesis of that. For those of us that are looking at the development of modernism through Wright's vocabulary, the stripping away of detail and techniques, allowing this, not buildings to look at, but rather buildings to see from, to engage with nature, that focus as much on prospect as on refuge, and maybe more on prospect than refuge. Graycliff is this brilliant articulation of Wright's principles. Reasonable minds will disagree. That's why we don't have the orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we can have the orthodoxy around these products that are inspired by and through Wright's principles either.
Yeah, yeah. A moment ago, you were talking about, your own experience staying at Taliesin West, and how, and I really like the point of Frank Lloyd Wright as a person, his presence almost being so strong that it takes time for a person to appreciate the work itself, after the kind of Starchitect, glamour wears off in a certain sense, right? And I think that's a really, really good point. One from the perspective of a tourist, because whenever we go visit a place, we inevitably see buildings, and we talk about the buildings afterwards. The biggest question I always have to myself is my understanding of that experience, how much of that was shaped because there was a emotional buildup for me to come see this thing. I drove out of my way, and knowing who designed it and all of that kind of story, versus the thing itself. And the other aspect of the story you told, it reminded me that I guess there's kind of two components to the mission as far as that goes. There's the first is one of accessibility, so allowing more people to experience and see things and to learn these things you're talking, and the other is the quality of the experience itself. And I guess some of the programs you do are looking at solving both of those.
Yeah, we, again, with the Taliesin Institute being formed, we're looking at at how we layer up experience, and you might even say ladder up experience, from the casual visitor that's looking for something to do while they're on vacation in Scottsdale or in Madison, Wisconsin, pardon me, all the way up to the to architects like yourselves and scholars who want a different quality of experience and a different way to engage. We have, for those people that want the experience mediated through stories about what Frank Lloyd Wright did, we have that experience. For those that want us to articulate the principles and show how they're demonstrated on the sites, we have that experience. For those that want to come in and really study it in depth, or to view his art collections, we have those experiences too. Currently on display at Taliesin West, we have a beautiful exhibition of Dale Chihuly's work. Chihuly is also inspired by nature. Chihuly also explores the intrinsic nature of his medium, glass, looking at its many qualities, its plasticity, but also how it differs in different lights, refraction, reflection. Even the physics of glass itself gets explored in his work. And bringing these two together allows us to look at both Wright's work and Chihuly's work in this fundamentally different way than seeing them separately or seeing them in other locations. So we're trying to, and then we offer, and this is a fairly new program for us, the self-guided experience. There are people who simply want to come up and be in the space. Mm-hmm. They don't want somebody talking at them. When we started to create these self-guided tours, we did a version of it that's recorded, so you listen to it through headphones as you stroll through the site. And that's so much different than with a live tour guide. Not better, not worse, but very different, because you're not focusing on an individual. You're not attending to that individual. But I will tell you that for me, the opportunity to simply be on the site with headphones on and a beautiful piece of music, or just listening to the desert, listening to the breezes and the up at Taliesin and the wind blowing through the crops on the farm up at Taliesin and just hearing the sounds of nature, it's extraordinary. So we want to offer all of those experiences. There are many ways to learn about Wright's principles. How do we give people all of those opportunities? And then the one more I want to mention, because it comes back to my experience as a kid. We do have these kids programs. And a lot of people think it's about getting kids to want to be architects, getting kids to be Frank Lloyd Wright enthusiasts, or to learn about design, learn about sustainability, some STEM education things. And that's all true. But I said, and those programs were, by the way, all on hold when I got here. And I said, we got to restart them right away, because this is where my passion comes from. But if the only thing a kid learns when they come up and learn about Frank Lloyd Wright's story and learn about design is that their original voices, the way they think about the world, is something that's worth expressing, and that they should pay attention to what they think about the world, and other people should be paying attention to what they think about the world. That these kids find their voices and articulate what they believe in the world. We are so much better off as a society every day. A kid learns that about themselves, learns to use their voice in the world. And I think that's a part of Frank Lloyd Wright's story too. And so that's another thing we want people to go away with, is that sense of their ability to make a difference in the world, to make this, in Wright's world, a better one for living in, and to give rhyme, reason, and meaning to life.
Oh, that's a beautiful soundbite. Yeah. The poetry of your description of being at a place designed by Wright with the wind, and all the way to the last bit, of course, with inspiring young kids. That's great.
I mean, if you really apply, Wright's thinking of looking forward, giving young kids access to his, work is probably the most forward you can be looking, right?
Marina, I don't know if you've ever read Wright's autobiography. It's written by a 70-year-old man, so of course it has very little to do with the truth. It's like any autobiography. It's the narrative of his life that he wants you to shape. Though, admittedly, right, he does some things in there. He makes some admissions in there that are against interest. He acknowledges that he starts off life as a bit of an anti-Semite. There's a surprise for a kid from rural Wisconsin, right? Mm-hmm. But by the time he makes it into the city and becomes, and builds his fellowship, he has Jewish clients, he has Jewish apprentices. many of whom would not have been allowed in other architecture practices. He designs a synagogue that changes the world, and he co-credits the rabbi with the design of the synagogue. So he shows his growth. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that read the opening pages of his autobiography, and he talks about a 9-year-old boy climbing up a hill with his uncle, and his uncle wants him to follow this straight path up to the destination on the hill. But Wright is meandering across his uncle's straight track, and he is gathering weeds because he finds them beautiful. He finds the shadows that they cast in the sunlight beautiful. And his uncle chides him for taking this meandering path instead of the straight line path. And Wright says, but the little boy, the 9-year-old boy, learns much more than his uncle intends to teach him. Mm-hmm. And what he's learning, no doubt, is that being exposed to the randomness of nature, finding your own path, is the key to success. And when you look at the autobiography, there are these beautiful graphic designs, and the graphic design that's associated with that part of the autobiography, you see a straight line, and you see this meandering path across it, stylized through Wright's graphic design principles. And it's stunning. It's beautiful. It's lyrical. And I go back every so often when I'm feeling like I'm maybe losing the path that the foundation should be on. And I'll go back and read passages from the autobiography. But I always come back to that passage. That passage, and I think another passage from Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is the opening paragraphs of his seminal essay on nature, that was really important to Frank Lloyd Wright. And, you see there that clear articulation of a life's work being viewed through the lens of a 9-year-old boy, or being viewed through the lens of the novice mind that Emerson is trying to articulate is essential to being a part of the natural world. And it's easy for me to articulate the poetry as you described it, David, of these places, because Wright built in poetry. He spoke in poetry. So it's not hard.
I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit there. But one question I had, and this is kind of a big question, I suppose, is what is the greatest challenge for the foundation? Is it earning enough capital to do what you need to do? Is it conveying things to the public? Is it, I don't know, what might it be?
Well, yes, to all of the above. Look, I think there, as I said earlier, we have some things that we could be doing, but sometimes a huge challenge is prioritizing, right? But we're also trying to sustain these historic sites and sustain this mission. And I'm not here to do a fundraising pitch, and you don't want me to do that. But there's always a need for more resources, to be sure. And the way that we go about that work of raising money to do our work is to engage people with the mission. When people feel, what I learned serving on boards over many years is that people engage in the act of philanthropy because there's a difference they want to see in the world, and they don't know how to do it on their own. So they find an organization that can help them make that difference in the world. Our whole idea around philanthropy is to engage people who want to make this difference that Frank Lloyd Wright's set of principles can realize in the world, this way of living as a part of the world around us, integrated with nature, inspired by nature, respectful of nature. And if we're good at our jobs, then hopefully some of those folks that want to see that difference in the world believe that sustaining these sites, doing the work that we're doing, will really help them make that difference that they want to see in the world. So we don't go around trying to ask for money. We hope we earn it by being good stewards of Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas, of the campuses at the two Taliesin's, supporting the rest of this ecosystem as best as we can, and winning over the hearts and minds of people who we hope we inspire to believe that this architecture for better living will make a difference in their lives, in the lives of their community, in the lives of future generations.
One last question from me, and I don't like asking this question because when it's been asked to me, I don't know what to say, to be honest.
Gosh. Okay.
Do you have...
You're making me really look forward to this.
I know, right? I know how to sell it. Is there a particular Frank Lloyd Wright building or piece of creation that he's done that moves you in a way that maybe others don't? Instead of me asking you for your favorite one,
that's well phrased.
Right?
Good job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. And Wright said organic architecture is a building of its time and place for its time and place. And so I think it's very hard at any given moment to articulate an answer to your question in an absolute sense. This is the one.
Yeah.
Because you're always bringing your experience at that moment to the question. There are moments when I can even think about buildings. I got to be nearly alone in the Guggenheim on Frank Lloyd Wright's 150th birthday, first thing that morning. And that being in that space that I had been in 100, 200 times, being in that space in that way literally reduced me to tears. I can go to a little house that needs a lot of help in Tallahassee, Florida, called the Lewis Spring House. And I hear Bird Mashburn, the daughter of the original owners, talk about that house and how it was designed for her parents, who were leaders in the community and who became leaders in the civil rights movement. That's a white family, but they really stuck their necks out and used that house as a way to get people engaged in the civil rights movement back in the 50s. And I can be moved to tears there. And I can be, sitting at Phoebe Point on the up at Taliesin. It overlooks the river. It's where where the stone that was used to build Taliesin, where it was quarried, was there, overlooking the Wisconsin River, watching the eagles fly, but just the barest glimpse of Taliesin through the woods coming through. And that can be my favorite place too. Wright often said that his favorite building was the next one. And I'll just say this, I would just say, the answer depends on what's going on at the moment, where you are. But I have never been in a Wright building that failed in some way to move me, to make me think differently about the world around me. And that should be, as these buildings are preserved as historic sites, house museums, whatever you want to call them, if they help change our minds about the world, then Wright's still doing his work.
I think one of the biggest takeaways from me in hearing you speak today is your view on all these different issues and your acknowledgement that it's very dynamic, all these things. And I think it's easy maybe to kind of want to classify and to work in absolutes, work in orthodoxy. But you were totally right that things are always shifting, whether it be the conversation about what your favorite building is, your favorite space, principles or designs, so that the things that they produce from them are ever evolving and changing. It's very, very dynamic. And even when you're designing something, I think it's also easy to look at something that's been done in the past and then want to like really, really crazy dissect it. But when you're in the motion of designing something, especially if you're a futurist, there's a lot of things at play that cause something to be the way it is. And, it's
more complex.
It's ever changing. Everything's ever changing.
Dynamic is the right word. Do I get to turn that question around, at least on Marina?
Yeah, absolutely.
Turnabout's fair play.
Well, no, I think your answer is right.
You can't do
right
that.
on point. No, but that's why I don't like this question personally, because I have many favorites, and you're absolutely right. It really depends, like where am I and what state of mind I am, and what's happening in the building I'm currently in. We previously chatted before this interview, and we told you we went to see the Johnson Wax building, right?
Oh yeah, it's crazy.
And it was just the two of us and the person who opened the door, and there is a particular feeling, being the only one there versus being part of a group of 30 people visiting a place. So there is something, you're kind of like preparing for the experience once again. Like, I don't know, maybe if I spend a week working in the Johnson building, I probably would feel differently. I don't know, right? But yeah, I mean, I think I have many buildings that move me. I don't know that I have a favorite.
Well, name a few. Come on.
Name a few? Well, Falling Water was pretty incredible. There is like old castle I saw when I was a kid in France, going out on weekends with my parents, that I felt like, wow, that's incredible. Like the work is just incredible. So, I'm just gonna just keep looking for those emotions to be awakened by architecture.
Yeah, I got to tell you, when and I don't know if we talked about this in our previous conversation, but I remember the first time I went to Saint-Chapelle.
Oh yeah, well, it's quite something.
I'm not religious, but I was pretty much ready to fall to my knees.
Yeah.
It's just and I think it's remarkable when architecture and any art form speaks to us across centuries. It reveals something not only about its time and place, but it also reveals something about the human condition at that time and place, and to be able to have that dialogue with it through, our experience of that building is in effect a dialogue with that building, and to ask, almost to interrogate that building as to what is it signaling to us, what is it telling us. That's really powerful, and the lens of the star architect today, where we have to go check these things off and put them up on Instagram. We were there. We're sort of losing that. We're losing that ability to be in dialogue with these buildings, with these spaces, and with these other cultures speaking to us across culture, across time, and being the steward of a couple of Frank Lloyd Wright's most personal spaces, I love creating that space for people to have that ability to dialogue with the work itself.
The last couple of questions from me, and they're sort of tied, maybe. And I was trying to figure out a word to describe this question, and I came up with the word relevancy, which I kind of don't like because it sounds too trendy and superficial. But it seems like an organization, a nonprofit that's focused around an individual who has passed away and has done work in the past. Is it a challenge for you guys to, I don't want to say stay relevant, but to keep people invested and interested in the work and things like that? I mean, obviously his work is phenomenal, so I feel like it'll generate interest for the next 1,000 years. But is that part of the challenge for the organization? And then the second part of that is what's next for you guys?
Yeah, so I think relevance is the exact right word, David. When we think about the relevance of, when we think about our work, the question is, what does it tell people today? How does it affect the way they live today? If it's just a way to pass time when we're not relevant, right? Where they could be, it's a spring training baseball game. They could be at the art museum. They could be going down a ski slope. It's just, whatever. To engage them in a deeper way, we have to show that we're offering them something that changes their lives, that changes their community, that changes the way they interact with the world around them. And fortunately, that 1.3 million entry archive, the set of ideas contained in that archive, and in the works themselves, in the buildings themselves, provide that relevance, because people tell us that when they come up, they feel differently. And by telling us that they feel differently in Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings than they feel in other places, they are implicitly expressing their curiosity about why they feel differently. And that's the opportunity to start to talk with them about Wright's ideas, about why they matter, about how they can bring them into their own lives, into their communities. So that's the nature of how we do it. We create the opportunity for people to come up, and it's not just necessarily come on up and see Frank Lloyd Wright spaces, because a lot of people, what's a Frank Lloyd Wright? What's a Taliesin? How do you even pronounce that word?
Right.
So, but we have Southwest Shakespeare perform at Taliesin West. We're restoring the theater at Taliesin in Wisconsin to be able to bring in musicians and artists and dance companies and theater companies to perform, because maybe that's the way in for somebody, is they come and experience the work in the space. And they say, I've had Tony Award-winning actors and writers, I've had Grammy Award-winning musicians say, it feels different when I perform here. What's going on? So there's that invitation to be curious and to explain and answer their curiosity. And that's how we will establish relevance. And we establish relevance not by, let's say, preserving the past as its own end, but by preserving the past as a basis for dialogue about the future. If you're not grounded in something, and we are grounded in the past, to be sure, then you are you're like a tumbleweed. You're just sort of rolling around wherever it takes you. But what are you really accomplishing by being grounded in the past, in Wright's work in the past, in these buildings from the past? We have a basis to start reaching for the stars, to start trying to accomplish something that outlives us, just as Wright's work outlived him. And so that's how we approach this. That's our basis for relevance. Grounding in the past, but relentlessly focusing on how these ideas shape the future.
It's fantastic.
And as far as new programs go, as I mentioned, the Taliesin Institute, some of the new programs on campus, the new ways to experience the campus. But ultimately, it's going to come back to those ideas and how those ideas help us relentlessly to think about the future.
That's great. Well, on that note, that's beautiful. This was a lot of fun, very insightful. I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on our show.
Well, thank you both. This has been a pleasure, both our earlier conversation and this one. And it's nice to get to know you. And I hope you'll come visit us and explore whether we have other things to talk about.
Hey, thanks everybody for listening to this episode. If you like this episode, then please support the show by leaving a review in the Apple Podcast app. Bonus, if you do that, then you enter a raffle to win an architecture book, which is the Architect's Studio Companion. It's around a $70 to $100 value book. Honestly, kind of chose it before I realized how expensive it was going to be. I have a copy myself. I've used it a lot in the past, so I think it's going to be very helpful for whoever gets it. Basically, you leave a review of the podcast and you take a screenshot right before you hit submit. So if you get selected when we announce the winner, that becomes proof that you are the person who wrote the review. Right?
Yeah. And of course, please leave a review no matter what, even if you don't want the book. I mean, it's the best way to support the show. You can also subscribe on Spotify and YouTube to our channel. Make sure you don't miss our episode when they get released. Mm-hmm. We're on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can send us direct messages there, and we oftentimes reply to these. We have the hotline too, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message, leave a voicemail. I think we're a little behind on these, but just keep reaching out. I also actually get some messages on LinkedIn, and
no kidding.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to reach out. I do respond to them as much as I can. So thanks for everyone who spent a few minutes reaching out. I really appreciate. And that's it. We have a lot more good stuff in the works. So
some exciting guests.
Please stay tuned and stay safe.
Stay safe
out there.
Talk soon. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.